Okay, I can start now.
Buenos días.
Muy buenos días.
Buenos días.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. We are the Innovations in Gender Equity class, and today we will talk about the gender in dual crisis, women at the intersection of climate change and COVID-19 as part of the Next Generation Leaders Program. Next slide. The program is made of students from different parts of the world. I'm going to introduce each of them. Adina from American University from Central Asia, Cameron from National University of Ireland, Daniel from Kenyatta University, Alina from Kenyatta University, Patrick from Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology. Next slide, please. Helen from Strathmore University, Ilaf from Harvard University for Women, Karen Cebes from Tecnológico de Monterrey, Carla García from Universidad Veracruzana, Kayla Asmi from Tecnológico de Monterrey, and Sarah from FI University. Our presentation will have different contexts, such as history and importance, role of women and the challenges, impacts of COVID-19, policy recommendations, opportunities, and finally, the conclusion. Before we begin, we must understand that women can play a critical role in response to climate change due to their local knowledge and leadership. However, since before the COVID-19 pandemic, the women's participation has not been taken seriously. But why? There are different reasons, such as climate change, the vulnerability that society imposes on women and how they perceive their role. The first problem is that the gender equity, which is not respected, and the impacts of climate change affect women and men differently. Women are more vulnerable to the effects of climate change than men because they constitute the majority of the workforce. And then gender inequality may dramatically limit the resilience and adaptive capacity of women and families and communities. And in consequence, the role of the women in the society. These are just some of the reasons. There are shocking statistics like 80% of people displaced by climate change are women, and other statistics is 2 million of women and children die prematurely due to the illness caused by indoor air pollution. That's an approximation of 4 per minute.
Meanwhile, after the health contingency for COVID-19, we found another results. Next slide, please. COVID-19 has had economic pressures on our society, which are complementary to the existing structural barriers, like discriminatory social norms and gender inequalities, that are exacerbated by climate change. It has been reported by many sources that women and girls face an increasing trend of domestic violence in the COVID-19 crisis. Women can be particularly affected by the sharp decline in economic activity in key sectors for female employment, such as tourism, manufacturing, commerce, and paid domestic work. In the case of tourism, it can also be affected by the climate change. Next slide, please. A 10-year set, which has been caused by a drop in the rate of female labor participation due to COVID-19, in addition to an increase in the number of Latin American women who will live in poverty. Next slide, please. Some statistics say that 70% of the world's low income are women.
So women are high in percentage of poor communities that are highly dependent on local natural resources for their livelihood, particularly rural areas where they shoulder the major responsibility for household water supply and energy for cooking and heating, as well as for food security. Women have limited access and control of environmental goods and services. They are highly negligible participation in decision making and are not involved in distribution of environment management benefits. Consequently, women are less able to confront climate change.
Hello, everyone. My name is Halima Dolif. I'm from Kenya. I study psychology at Kenyatta University. And today I'm going to speak about the role of women in environmental conservation. So let's begin. In the next slide, I'm going to talk about the knowledge that women have, and this makes them hold a very crucial role in environmental conservation. So women play an important role in conserving biodiversity due to the important role in household activities. As we all know from our homes, women feed most of the population. They are the bearers of the natural resources. They're the ones who use the resources the most in terms of feeding. And they also have a major influence on children where they are playing the part of teaching them about the importance of nature and conserving biodiversity. And also another thing is that women in rural settings, especially in developing countries like Kenya, have different roles and priorities from men. For instance, women are more likely to prioritize a varied diet for their children. And we can also tell just from our homes that your mom knows what to give to a young child, what to give to an elderly child. So they know how different varieties of plants and seeds affect our immunity and our health. And also they treat family members with free and easily accessible herbal medicines when they fall sick. So this shows that men tend to be more focused on cash and non-food crops when women have more intense and massive information about medicinal aspects of the environment, and they tend to understand more. So this information is very crucial in the conservation of the environment. I'd also like to give you guys a story of a great lady. I'm sure some of you guys know her. Her name is the late Wangari Mathai. She was a very important person in terms of environmental conservation in Kenya and in Africa and the whole world at large. She made a huge change in terms of looking at the environment and the role of women, and looking at the age at which she was born. She was born in 1940, and that is a time in our country, Kenya, when people had really rigid mentalities about the participation of women in legal settings and the preservation of the environment. So she started an organization known as Green Belt Movement, and together they managed to plant almost 30 million trees. So this shows that women can actually break barriers and they can do so much for environment. They can even change the world. Another familiar name to all of us is Greta Thunberg. She was just born in 2003. During that year, most of us didn't really make as much changes as we would. But look at this young girl who actually became an activist, and she started a global strike movement to protest against government's inaction on the climate crisis. Since then, millions of young people have demonstrated on the streets and online, asking the world leaders to listen and to take action to protect the environment. So we can see women can actually be actors of change. They can effect change in terms of the environment, and they can prevent climate change. More inspiring stories is from Kenya, my own home country. There's the northern part, and there's tribe known as the Samburu, and the women are known for cutting down trees for fuel. But now that they are liberated and they understand the impact of that to the environment, and they understand the aspect of climate change, they are now managing the forest directly, and they're the ones who are being in the front line and using it sustainably and reporting any illegal activities to the authority. There's also another group in the western side of Kenya who use camphor basil, and they use it to help the community, and they make it an entrepreneurial venture. So they're learning new ways of using the environment wisely and being sustainable. So moving on to the challenges in the next slide that women face in environmental conservation, women are not paid for handing down traditional knowledge about plants and the land they live on. Women play such a huge role on amassing the information I talked to you guys about, the medicines, the ways of conserving the environment, and they're not really acknowledged for having this information. They're not acknowledged for the growth they do. They grow so many trees, they nurture and collect the medicinal plants that the family needs from time to time, and they are neither invited nor given the opportunity to share their views on development initiatives with the community. The first-hand knowledge of the environment and its uses tend to be not to be taken into consideration when it comes to finding sustainable agricultural solutions that support their families. And moving on, I'd like to make a call for action. If you can go, yeah. Before we go into the climate change impact, I'd like to make a call for action, and I'd like to call upon every single one of us to create awareness of the essence of conserving the environment and engage women more in research, policy making, and efforts to conserve the environment. I believe we are all witnesses to the importance women hold in environmental conservation, from the little things to the big things they do, from the little changes they make, even in our homes. Even you as a person, you know, when you're not feeling well, your mother can tell you if your stomach is bloated, they know that ginger helps. So them having this information should be acknowledged. They should be given a chance to play a role in making changes for the environment, thus saving the world. I believe that we can all change our mindsets to make even the smallest efforts. And at the end, I would like to say that liberation of the earth and liberation of women is the liberation of all humanity, and it's the next step of freedom that we need to work for, and it's the next step of peace that we need to create. All we have to do is to create awareness of how every single person can contribute into conserving the environment. Climate change has so many impacts, especially to women. Climate change threatens their health, talking about reproductive health, and women are the ones who go out to fetch water, to fetch firewood, and the extreme heat has so many effects on them. They suffer from dehydration, heat stroke, all in the name of sustaining the family. So the environmental conditions also cause economic pressure, which leads to adverse effects on women as well. Things like early child marriages, domestic violence, and children having, especially young girls, being left out of education. So this thing affects so many women in so many ways, and we need to find a way to curb it. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you. I'd like to call on to the next person.
Thank you, Halima. I'll continue on the notes that Halima have touched on, which is women in environmental conservation and the women's role in food and agriculture. Next slide, please. Looking at climate change has serious ramification in 4 dimensions of food security, which is food availability, food accessibility, food utilization, and food system stability. In that context of climate change, traditional food resources become more unpredictable and scarce. Next slide. Women the role of women in agriculture and food. Women are key to food production. In developing countries, women comprise of 45% of agricultural labor force, with that figure raising up to 60% in parts of Asia and Africa. In the Near East, women contribute up to 50% of agricultural workforce, which is, let's confess. It's time-consuming, labor-intensive, and it's manual. In Latin America and the Caribbean, women as well are contributing in farming, particularly in poultry, raising small livestock. Next slide. If women had access to productive resources as men, they could increase the yields to their farms by 20 to 30%, potentially resulting in 100 to 150 million fewer hungry people in the world. But there are so many challenges when it comes to women facing climate change as players in the food and agriculture sector. During extreme weather, such as droughts and floods, women tend to work more to secure their household livelihoods. Female farmers have limited access to land, to markets, and to education compared to men. And when coupled with an inaccessibility to resources and decision-making processes, limited mobility, this places women where they are disproportionately affected by climate change. Next slide. Climate change has so many impacts. When sea level rises, salt water intrude and destroy whole fields of rice and crops, and food security and livelihoods are put at risk at that point. Women face loss of income as well as harvest when these climate change weather impact their fields and their farms, especially when they are farmers and their sole source of food and income is that land. Increase in food prices makes food more inaccessible to poor people, which would happen when climate change happens and there are less food on the market and higher demand. And then who will be impacted? Women will be particularly impacted, women and girls. And studies have shown that health of women found to be declined more than male in times of food shortages. Climate change will be certainly an added stressor and will aggravate women vulnerability. Next slide.
Thanks, Halima and Tara. Hello, good morning. My name is Carla Jasmine Garcia Antonio. I'm from Mexico, Veracruz, and I study at the Universidad Veracruzana Intercultural, talking a little about the role, challenges, and impact of climate change that women face in the water is an important issue that we cover in this presentation. Next, please. Women's role in Africa, America, and Asia in general. Women and men have different roles in rural communities. It's women who have to provide the use of water in their homes, carry out the organization and the consumption of in case of not having drinking water, in addition to spending most of the day doing housework. This means that the role of women in their communities is even greater than that of men, even in matter of care in general, not only the care of water, but also of the environment that surrounds them and of people. Here's the care of water in addition to housework in case the mother is not at home. The impact that climate change has on women and girls affect the scarcity of water and sanitation through drought. And next, please. The challenges they face are decisions making in the defense of their territories is not equitable. The right to information must be equal between men and women during assemblies in the communities. Women face scenarios of violence in defense of their right to consumption and the right to drinking water, including domestic violence and sexual assault. And transporting water to their homes causes physical health problems for women and girls. They are also vulnerable to abuse and attack while on this journey. Next, please. Climate change affects the entire population, increasing the rise of drought, causing the loss of growth, flora and fauna, causing food shortages, aggraving the situation of women and girls around the world in fragile situations of their human rights, mainly on your health and safety. And according to UN Women, the consequences of drugs are violence against women, maternal mortality, infections, malnutrition, poverty, and illegal land grabbing. Less sanitization and hygiene, life conditions, food safety, food supply, and school attendance. We are agents of change, and we are here to generate change together in conditions on gender equality, because we must take action on the face of the climate change crisis, which affects all countries and mainly the most vulnerable population, women and girls in the world. And thanks for listening, and that's all from me.
Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me from the other side. My name is Irungu Helen Wanyora, and I am a fourth-year law student in Strathmore University, which is in Nairobi, Kenya. A fun fact about Nairobi is that it is the only city in the whole world with a national park. And as such, if you are into such things as the jungle, the forest, wild animals, and all that, I would highly recommend you or advise you to come and see what we've got. Now, my presentation will look at the impact of COVID-19 in exacerbating gender inequalities in climate action. Now, climate action is all things that are done in a bid or in a trial, or in us trying to mitigate or just in us trying to stop the climate changing towards the negative, you know? And I won't rely much on my slides, and hence I will highly encourage you to pay attention to what I have to say. Now, I will focus on three main issues which we experienced during the pandemic, and that is the increase in teenage pregnancies, increase in the number of domestic violence cases, and loss of employment, and what this means to women's participation in climate action. Now, I will start with the increase in teenage pregnancies. You understand that in a bid to mitigate the spread of the pandemic, schools were closed, and they were closed for quite a long period of time. And unfortunately, not every child lives in a safe environment. And as such, most of the girls, a majority of whom comes from vulnerable situations, were preyed on and they got pregnant. Unfortunately, because of the situation at home, most of these girls are unlikely. It's unlikely that they are going back. They are going to go back to school. And what does education mean? We all know what education means to a young person, to a woman, or to a child. A research conducted by UNDP in 25 developed countries and 25 developing countries showed that in those parliaments where there is a high women representation, they are likely to enact laws that seek to conserve environment. Now, you understand that for you to be a member of parliament or to reach some of these levels, you need to have a good level of education. And that means that, unfortunately, for these girls who never got a chance to finish school because the pandemic happened and they got pregnant, unfortunately, their voice will go unheard in some of these spaces. In this conference, for me to be in Next Generation Leaders Forum, I had to be a university student. What if I had gotten pregnant in high school and unfortunately never got a chance to go back to school and make it to the university? What could have happened? I would not be here. You understand? Now, we have been told about the great environmentalist, the late Professor Wangari Mathai, who actually won a Nobel Peace Prize, you know. she said that what inspired her to be an environmentalist is the fact that when she came from her studies abroad, she realized that there's so much that was happening. The river where she grew up was drying up, and in her community, women didn't have somewhere to go and get firewood, you know. And this inspired her to start a movement, the Green Belt movement. Apart from that, she planted trees. Apart from that, she encouraged women to form groups that planted trees, you know, women tree planting groups. So you come together and you like plant a forest of your own. Apart from that, she was a professor of environmental studies at the University of Nairobi. She was in active politics, and between 2002 and 2007, she served as an assistant minister in the Ministry of Environment. Now, you all understand, or we all agree that her education played a big role in her engagement. Yes, she could have still planted trees, you know, but because of all that she had garnered during her education journey, she was able to have a greater success. She was able to reach more people, you know. I'm not saying that these girls cannot influence things for the better. I'm just saying that their participation will be limited for those who won't get a chance to go back to school. On to my second issue, and that is the issue of domestic violence. Now, pre-COVID, United Nations Women had stated that 30% of world's women have experienced a case of intimate partner violence. And during COVID, this skyrocketed because because of remote working and lockdown. I find that women were being locked down with potential abuses, you know. And actually, things are not improving because remote working is here to stay. For my case, I'm a student, you know, and you find that 1 week I study in school, the other week I'm studying at home. Now imagine if I was in my house, I was staying with an abusive partner. You see, the interactions, because of these increased interactions and the many frustration that COVID has caused, there would be high increase of me being abused. And what does abuse mean to a person? My goodness, abuse, there's a way abuse just puts you down. It kills your self-esteem. It has you feeling like you're no one, you're nothing, you know, and therefore even what you say or what comes out of you does not matter, you see. And you can imagine if the whole night you are being beaten by your partner and the following morning there's a tree planting session, most probably you won't turn up because you're just afraid. Oh my goodness, is my face swollen? Can anybody see that I was beaten? Because you remember, no one, in most cases, domestic violence happens to be stigmatized. You know, as much as we encourage women to report when they are being abused, in most of these spaces, no one wants to come out and say they are being abused. You know, the fact that it kills your self-esteem, even when you get such a forum, you find it hard to express yourself, to express your ideas on how things can be done, on how we can move to a better place, you see? And all this is because of the increase of domestic violence cases. Now, onto my third issue, and that is the issue of loss of employment. A report published by International Labour Organization, it is entitled 2 Decades of National Policies, 2000 to 2022, something like that. It is stated that when it comes to labor matters, both genders have been affected differently depending on the sector they work in, how fragile their employment is, their access to labor and social protection and care responsibilities. Now, putting all of these factors together, we find that women's jobs are relatively more at risk than women's, and in a rapidly deteriorating context. You know, as such, women are losing their jobs at a greater speed than men. And in those cases where one does not lose their job, you find that there's a greater care obligation, which is forcing them to cut down on the hours they do paid work, they perform their paid duties. And if one does not do this, you find that they are extending their total working hours, that is both paid and unpaid labor, to unsustainable levels, you see. And what is, again, is the impact of this in women's participation in climate action? One is the matter of finances. Now, if you don't have a job or you have less money, definitely it will be hard to contribute to some of these causes. You understand that as much as countries have been encouraged to fund climate action causes, most of them have not done so adequately. And hence, you have to go back to your pocket and remove or get money to fund maybe whatever you want to engage in. Now, for example, in this conference, we acknowledge that all of us have learned so much. But you have to understand that actually there were mainly two options. You either, I think, you had to pay or you had to join via a promo code, having been invited by a student. There are so many people who could have wanted to come and exchange in these ideas, but unfortunately they could not because they didn't have money. You see, I understand that yesterday, Marcy Koti and the group encouraged us to share knowledge. That is very good, but you need to attend some of these forums yourself so that you can get to hear things for yourself and you can get to learn and unlearn things, you see? And then after that, with the people that you attended the conference from, you can ideate, engage further, and go ahead and impact your community. Again, with the issue of this having unsustainable working hours, you find that what will happen is that one has less hours or less time to engage in climate action causes, because this is, for example, you have to pick, with COVID-19, even money reduced, the salaries reduced, people, they were cut. And therefore, you find that some people have to pick 2-3 jobs, women, to sustain their families. And don't forget that because of the way most of our cultures are set up, women are the one who take care of most of the domestic duties. So even despite you taking 3 duties or 3 work or 3 engagements, you still have to go back home and cook. At the end of the day, you're so tired, so you don't have a lot of time to engage in climate action matters, you see? And now, my closing remarks with regards to this section is that COVID-19 has impoverished women and it has made an already bad situation to be worse. It's not like pre-COVID we were on the same ground level. We were not, we were still at a lower level. But with this pandemic, things actually have moved now to a worse state. It's like there's a multiple of crises. There's so many things that women are grappling with, and I think we need to do something so that we can mitigate these effects. That's from me on the impact that COVID-19 has had in exacerbating the gender inequalities that existed in climate action, and Patrick will continue from there on the opportunities. Thank you.
So Mike, if you can change to the slide after that. Perfect. So thanks so much, Helen, for giving us that overview on the impacts of COVID-19 on gender equity. So folks, my name is Cameron Keekran, and I'm a PhD student in the School of Medicine in the National University of Ireland, Galway. So delighted to be speaking to you from the west coast of Ireland, quite far away from most of my teammates and group mates. So delighted to be here. So I suppose we've given you an overview here of the impact of climate change and climate action on women and girls and gender equity, and then also the impact of COVID-19. And as we kind of come to the last couple of sections of this presentation, we want to tie that all together with some of our own thoughts, reflections, and also some, I suppose, conversations that we had. So myself and Elaf, who will be talking after me, we did a number of interviews for this particular section on policy changes and current reflections to see how gender inequity, climate action, climate change, and COVID-19 was affecting women on the ground. And I suppose their thoughts on where we are now and what our next steps should be. So for the current reflections on gender and climate change within policy, I'll talk about 3 different sections, the first 2 that are on this slide here. So the first one that I'll talk about is the lack of gendered analysis. So the lack of inclusion of women and girls in the analysis of the impact on climate change, as well as the impact COVID has had on climate. And so to start this off, gender considerations are sometimes mentioned in climate policies, in gender and in COVID-19 policies, but they're rarely a central part of the public policy analysis of climate change. They're rarely a central part of plans to tackle climate change. And then they're also rarely a part of the implementation of climate change policy. If I speak from a European context, a number of months ago, we had a policy released from the European Union on, I suppose, the science behind climate change and climate action. And it's about a 400 or 500 page document, and I searched it, and gender wasn't mentioned once as an influence or as an impact or as something to even consider in the climate crisis or how we tackle the climate crisis going forward. So it is an under-researched area, and despite anecdotally being written about and being talked about, there's not a huge amount of current research or inclusion of gender analysis in mostly in this case, developed countries, but also in some extent developing countries. And so it's not generally developed enough to influence current climate policies. But when I mentioned the difference there between developed and developing countries is that there is, I suppose, a more extensive amount of research in developing countries. And this is often down to developed countries seeing climate issues and climate change as a more of a homogeneous issue that affects the entire population, as opposed to understanding the implications that it has on different parts of our society. And most likely and often more extensive research in developing countries due to sometimes the direct impact climate change is having on work environments such as forestry, fishing, and a number of the topics and issues that were discussed by my previous teammates in previous slides. And also the international agencies who are trying to connect sustainable development and the funding associated with it to more inclusive gender-based analysis and more inclusive gender policies. So it's important that gender issues are integrated into development policy as well as solutions to climate change, because some of the issues that we mentioned here in terms of violence against women, poverty, income loss, can be directly impacted by including gender-based analysis in our development policies and our solutions to climate change. And so the last point I'll mention on this is that often policy decisions do not include the unique experiences of women, especially in response to COVID-19. And often this is down to not talking to those that are affected, not talking to areas and to folks who have experienced the worst sides of climate change and are not yet included in any discussions around climate action, despite often being more knowledgeable around what works in their environment and what doesn't. The second, I suppose, reflection that we had from the interviews that we did was around vulnerability in work. And our previous teammates have talked a little bit about this in terms of the precarious nature of work often that women and girls are doing across the globe, and also how a global pandemic like COVID-19 could have on that. And we'll see in some of the anecdotes that we've pulled out of the interviews going forward, where vulnerability in work really came into play during the COVID-19 pandemic. But there is a need to challenge often misogynistic or male-focused tendencies in working policies and policies made in response to global pandemics in the working environment that are often seen again as a homogenous policy without understanding the intricacies that face women and girls across the globe. And so policy changes to work and work environments, as said, can often have negative consequences on women and girls when we do not understand the unique challenges that they face and the unique barriers that women face in entering into work and in entering into the work environment. And climate change affects the type of work available and it impacts on the ecosystems that have been created within different communities and within different workforces, depending on the division of labor, the types of work that's available, the skills, the access to education, and so on and so forth, which often has more of an impact on women than it does on men. But yes, it's not really reflected in any policies that are aimed at, I suppose, approaching these changes in the working environment in response to climate change. Next slide, please. And so then the third one that kind of ties the first two reflections together is around national and international policy and activism, and the implications of the exclusion of gender in discussions around climate change and action policy. And hopefully through discussions like this and groups and I suppose more of an open discussion around policy, we'll have a movement towards more inclusive policy in response to global pandemics, but also in response to climate action and climate change. And there's huge considerations needed in the future around research and policy decisions around, I suppose, the gender pay gap, climate action and policy on workforces that are particularly vulnerable, unique challenges faced by particular groups, such as those with caring responsibilities, and also the access to education, which falls under a lot of the work that we would do on policy and activism. But the most important thing to remember here is that when we talk about implementing changes, or we look at how we are making changes in different environments, that we ensure that when we look around the table, that those that are most affected have a place to have their voice heard. And we talked about that before, where Helen mentioned where there is voices of some women and girls who will go unheard. And it's our duty, and as Halima mentioned, a call to action, it's our duty to ensure that all of those that need a space at the table around these discussions are included, and that the policies reflect their lived experience and their rights and their needs. And so again, often women are more knowledgeable when it comes to climate change and climate action, and often are more likely to engage in, I suppose, progressive policy, progressive pro-climate action, but they're often not consulted or they're excluded by the decision makers. So this, I suppose, then leads to a huge level of gender inequity when we look at activism, when we look at who is around the table and who's making the decisions, and also ensuring that those voices are heard. And so before we move on to the I suppose before we move on to the different anecdotes, there's two words that I'd like people to consider when we finish with this reflection session, when we finish with this session overall, is that participation and consultation are two of the key things in order to ensure that women feel like they have a space to have their voice. So actively encouraging women to share their voice, to share their lived experiences, and to make sure that when we reflect on what we're doing, if it's with climate change or in response to global pandemic, we look and see who was consulted, and is that reflective of the population that we're representing? And if it's not, how do we achieve that? And so as we move into what we would think are some policy recommendations, I want to give you a sense of what people on the ground have felt in response to COVID-19, in response to climate action, and really hear it from their words. And I'd really like you to try and put yourself in the shoes of these women that were very gracious to talk to us around their experiences and around their thoughts. So if you could go to the next slide. So the first story here is from Amuna Amin Abdul Jalil, who's 36 years old and lives in Al Ushara. She's a widower with 5 kids and also bearing the responsibility of 2 of her nephews, her brother and her mother. In total, the breadwinner for 10 people. She worked as a tea seller in front of a grocery store within her neighborhood and usually worked during the evening from after sunset till midnight. However, COVID-19 affected her work significantly. There was a curfew policy implemented that meant that her time was now limited and she couldn't work at night where she got her customers. And there was not enough work these days for her to support the 10 people in her life. And so this is an example of how we look at vulnerability in work and how policies have not, I suppose, understood or taken into account the unique working situations of certain people within our community, particularly looking at women and girls. And so this particular woman then suffered through the COVID-19 pandemic and was less likely to be able to work, and therefore, as Helen has mentioned before, less likely to be able to engage in climate action and climate change policies. So the next slide, please. So the next example that we have is from Canada. And I've highlighted some of the words here, but I'll read it out for yourselves. Climate change impacted Canada as many places. And even though it's a cold country, we had heat waves, so many people died because of it, and the fire in British Columbia. Other parts of the country had winds and snow. People were dealing with dual emergencies and the government's ability to respond properly. A lot of crops burned in addition to drought, so a lot of prices became more expensive for women, especially since more women were laid out of their jobs since the fields they worked the most in were also affected by the lockdown, such as the hospitality industry, tourism, domestic work, and more. Many local farmers faced health issues during the fires and heat waves, and the health units and hospitals had been overwhelmed with COVID, so they didn't respond properly. A lot of agriculture workers are migrants that come from Mexico, and it's a lower paying job. They were exposed to COVID and not treated well and didn't receive the same healthcare as Canadians. And they were also not able to have enough food or unionize, and agricultural corporations exploited them. Indigenous women are leading the fight against the fossil fuel industry in Canada. Protesters, brackets, tiny house warriors, built houses to block constructions, and the Canadian police cracked down on them violently, which I speculate happened because they thought with the COVID crisis, fewer people were watching. COVID prompted the police to be harsher, and the most hurt in the process were Indigenous women. So again, we can see here some of the things that we've been talking about vulnerability in the working environment, different responses and not understanding the unique challenges that women and girls were facing. But also, I suppose, the impact that COVID-19 had, where we are dealing with a dual crisis or sometimes several crises or crises. And so things can go off the radar. And in this particular instance, we can see that Indigenous women were the most hurt in this, despite fighting for climate action, climate change, and what they believed in. They were met with violence and they were met with harsher conditions than what they would have been previous to this. Next slide. And so the last example that we'll give you, and it leads quite nicely into the section for ELAF Next, is around, I suppose, the role of universities in this conversation, and what can we do as university students, staff, and academia. So climate change is such a big and overwhelming issue that equality, even though very important, isn't focused on enough. Women in STEM subjects are still clearly in the minority. Universities are supposed to educate, enhance their community with new ideas, new technologies, and encourage innovation and research. Thus, universities should be a place to try new things and can be seen as a pilot for the whole community, for example, in renewable energy technologies or innovative waste recycling. Funding for such projects should be way more available. Universities should support innovation in as many ways as possible and include minorities in their planning. So again, those two words are participation and consultation coming through really strongly in this particular example. So I'll leave you with that, and I'm delighted to hand over to ELAF for the next section.
Okay, hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are. My name is Yilaf and I come from Sudan. I live in Khartoum and it's very hot these days. So in this part, I will be talking about the policy recommendations in a post-pandemic world to improve gender inclusion in climate action. And like my colleague Cameron said earlier, these recommendations are basically community-centered and community-led. We made sure that we are capable of reflecting the needs and the voices of the women and girls that we interviewed. The people we interviewed either belonged to the academia institution or in the CSO's sector. They were activists for climate action and for gender equality. And then we also interviewed grassroots women. And these are the main themes that came up while we were doing the interviews. My colleague Cameron has already spoken about how COVID-19 as a socioeconomic crisis influenced women and vulnerable groups different than other populations. And in this part, I will focus on what is the role of universities and what they can do in terms of policymaking with regards to pandemic resilience and pandemic management and recovery, and then what can make for well-informed practices on how to mitigate the unique way women are experiencing the climate crisis and the pandemic. So the first theme we have is inclusive research. And it's really about creating research opportunities to understand the impact of gender in climate action and also the meaningful inclusion of women and girls. And in this area, we have 3 recommendations. The first one is that in their research capacity, universities must look at the impact of dual crises. So for example, COVID-19 and climate change and their impact on women and marginalized groups. And then the second recommendation is research produced by universities in these topics must be action-oriented and it must employ innovation as a tool of problem solving. And research practices, widely being rigid and inflexible, came as a trend amongst most of the academics and the activists that we've spoken to. And so innovation and innovation in research has been an important theme that came out of these recommendations. And using innovation can basically, how using innovation can accelerate the process of addressing climate change and COVID-19. This takes me to my next point, which is that research must look at how these issues can be addressed in a time-sensitive manner, as well as develop strategies to mitigate future crises and to address the climate change repercussions through directly involving women, grassroots, and indigenous communities in their work. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so the second theme we have is education and work. And what this theme is about is basically creating policy that safeguards the access and opportunity for education and upskilling, particularly in areas that are closest to climate change, while understanding the unique impact global pandemics might have on these areas. And how there should be some special considerations, including with regards to housing, finances, food, and healthcare. And so the first recommendation we have in this theme is that climate change, technology research, and climate innovation done by universities must be gender sensitive. The second recommendation we have is that universities must encourage thought leadership by funding student, indigenous, youth, and women-led research in these areas, as they are the categories that are most influenced by the dual crisis of change, of climate change and COVID-19. And lastly, that universities must create ethical and moral obligations and considerations about academia's responsibilities to address the patriarchal nature of the educational system, and to highlight how that influences the quality of research produced by them, by sidelining women, academics, and researchers in the work that they do. And schools, being basically patriarchal institutions, has created a real obstacle to the advancement of women and development, and to addressing the issues that they experience in a way that centers their voices and their experiences in the process. And what we usually see in schools is that despite the differences when it comes to different schools in different areas and different principles, they remain the same, where men remain in control in most academic and educational institutions. And even though the nature of this control might differ, but what it does is that it creates male bias in academia, and therefore it makes education as a whole and research more specifically something that is viewed through the male gaze. Next slide. So the last thing that we have is networking or creating networks. And in this theme, what we wanted is to focus on how universities can have a unique opportunity to create national and international networks to share ideas, best practices. And that's mainly because universities have a mass population of youth who could lobby to push for policies and for laws, and in the process, of course, change. And additionally, they can implement grassroots campaigns or transnational and international campaigns through their network. So the first recommendation is opportunities should be created with the focus of creating dialogue and engaging young people in these dialogues. And these networks and platforms should be supported and funded by universities, and with the aim of connecting people globally, because we understand that climate change is an issue that is interconnected on a global level, and therefore we cannot address it if we're not making sure that we are addressing the interconnectedness and the intersectionalities between the different contexts that climate change takes place in. And the second recommendation is that universities should work together to create spaces to share ideas and expertise in tackling both climate change as a whole and how to offset the impact that it is having on women, with putting in mind how women are also influenced by COVID-19. And I think this platform, this conference that we're having right now is a step in the right direction. However, I think more efforts should be done in ensuring the outcomes of such platforms are actually implemented and fostered by the universities that are part of the Talwar networks. And with that, I will leave you. My colleague Patrick is going to talk about opportunities. So thank you very much.
Thanks everyone. Just next slide, please, as I come on board. Thank you everyone. I'm Patrick Oyenga. I'm an MSc Research Methodology student from Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology in Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you so much for being here. I'm also a founder of CBO, that's a community-based organization, which deals with the empowering and capacity building among youth and of course the community, which we target to improve the lives of the vulnerable. Thank you so much. Of course, having my colleagues having mentioned some of the areas that we have been discussing in the last 6 months under this program, NGL. We're so grateful for the opportunity, for the training and the participation, networking and knowing each other. Of course, now we wind up with this discussion on this particular topic about gender equity, which is, of course, a contemporary issue among SDGs. Everyone should be able to remember that even it was among the MDGs. And you remember even before the MDGs, they were talking about the GDP. Everything was being measured on GDP, but we moved to MDG. And now we're talking about SDGs. Apparently, every aspect of development across the globe, especially under guidance under UN, is touching on gender equity, where we know that the role of women, what women can play. Well, now, having on what is existing, what is women are going through, of course, some of the gap that we're having as of today. Thank you so much. We're saying that one of the opportunities that we have, we can take on board is the multi-stakeholder approach, multi-sectoral approach to climate change and gender action. Of course, here we're talking about, are we able to involve every stakeholder in this? Are we able to have, there are so many sectors. We have even agriculture sector. Someone was mentioning something about the women in agriculture. Someone was assuming talking about the finance sector, assuming that we're talking about the employment, assuming that we're talking about culture. Are we able to enhance all these and bring them on board to look at gender change, the one we want to achieve, that both women and men have equal chances to participate in changing the environment that we need? The second, of course, opportunity we have is ensuring that there is equal space for resource for women and men, possibly in what we're talking about in climate change decision making. Assuming that we're having a body that is coming on board to develop some policy or to pass some guidance on which way to take, so that we reverse on maybe a resource, either resource utilization. We're talking maybe about depletion of some resources. Even someone has mentioned about tree cutting. Are we able to bring even women on board so that they can even give their views on what we can do as a community, as a country, as a globe? Are we making sure that women are participating? The third one we can talk about, we can definitely use women as agents of change. And I'm happy that my counterpart, of course, who's coming also from Kenya, Strathmore, Helen mentioned something about the former Nobel Prize winner, Wangari, who was actually an agent of change. And she used women through courting women to make sure that they form groups to drive toward the change about especially planting of trees. Are we able to use women as agent of change? And for example, today in Kenya, where we're having elections next year, how many are maybe using women to make sure that women are coming on board? And towards the end of the election here, we're making sure that they are here with us. They're also participating in the decision that we are taking. The decision we are going to make as a nation to elect our leaders in the country. Are we using women to come around and participate and make these decisions? We're talking also about including girls' rights in national climate strategies. Of course, there have been these policies across the globe, which mention about climate strategies, and downwards, each country has some 1 or 2 strategies by which they're using to make sure that climate change actually looks at women and their participation. Are we able to include even girls? Of course, now we're talking about starting from the bottom. We're talking about these girls are the women for tomorrow. They are coming up as women. Are we able to include them? How are we going to do this? We ensure that even in the curriculum, in the education, are we having and telling them that there's a role that women can play? And as they grow up as young girls, they're able to know that as I'm growing up in the next 15 or 20 years, I'm supposed to take action on this and this. Next slide, please. Yes, interesting to have these statistics from UN. They're talking about that if women had the same access to productive resources as men, they could increase yields by 20 to about 30%. You see, that is so significant. And assuming that we're talking about we want to change the climate, what we're talking about, maybe want to stop tree cutting, we want to plant more trees. Can we have these even resources availed to women so that their participation can increase this yield by 20 to 30% from the statistics we are having? Then another opportunity we're having, talking about use of fairness, equity, and climate justice. Assuming that we have laws and policy frameworks that are targeting climate change, are we able to make sure that these policies are providing fairness and equity, not just maybe across whichever class, social class, or backgrounds or ethnicity, but across both gender? Are we looking at where is the role of we're having a table to discuss this and that? Where is the position of the women in this? Then from that, of course, these are about the last opportunity maybe we can have. We have education. And remember, this is also captured in the MDGs and SDGs as we're growing up. We're talking about achievement of basic education for everyone across the globe, making education even a human right. As we achieve this, are we making sure that we can use this education to make sure that we can be able to disseminate information about climate change, about how we can come about with these using women in the change? So using education, now that education, and I'm happy about, of course, statistics show that there is quite much achievement towards the achievement of basic education across the globe. Like, for example, in Kenya, where I come from, when the government rolled out in 2003, all the way back in 2003, about free primary education, there have been significant improvement, almost 90% of enrollment in preschool. So having known this, that provides an opportunity that all these children are in school. Can we use this school, now education, of course, to disseminate information about gender equity and equality in climate change? If at all we're able to enhance this through possibly putting environmental education in all our curriculums, I think we should be able to achieve this. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you everyone. Of course, those who have come to participate, those who have come to hear about our discussion, the 6 months that we have been this training guided by great coaches here, Sir Phil and Madam Ruvimbo. Thank you. We're saying that as we round up, we're saying that together we can make a difference in the world through gender equity. Thank you so much. And of course, as we wind up this, we welcome any question, but we have some fundamental questions for discussion. And we just calling upon that as we wind up and we go into a roundtable discussion, we're going into a roundtable discussion. We have a fundamental question that we want to answer as a group. And maybe, of course, as participants, I know we have here the moderators and even professors and professionals from different backgrounds. The question we're having for our discussion is that statistics from OECD, it shows that actually the significant increase of women being brought in to participate across not only climate action, but even in employment. But apparently, the same statistics is shocking that when you're talking about this, you find out that, like, for example, when talking about top managerial levels, you find that, yeah, there is almost an equal participation of both women and men. But now apparently and shockingly that when you go now back and look at the salaries, you will find out that even if they are in top leadership, yes, but their salaries are significantly less than the men's. That a job being offered, an opportunity comes up, a HR position, they advertise, and they saying this is the amount they're going to give to remunerate this monthly salary. But apparently you find out that men are not ready to take up that position because of the level of the income they've been given, but women are taking up that. So as much as we have that they're in the top leadership, but there are significant difference in the earnings. So is this illusion or is it an achievement? Kindly, this is open for discussion. And thank you, Cameron, under your leadership, we say thank you. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Patrick. And as Patrick has said there, you can feel free to comment on that particular question, or I suppose that statement. And this is also a space, you've got about maybe 20 more minutes of the session. So if anyone does have, I know there's a few questions that have come in through the chat, and I've took down some areas that we might comment on if people need to, but feel free to just raise your hand on Zoom or to unmute yourself and to ask a question of any of the speakers that are here, and a couple of others from our group that are also present today. So with that, is there any questions, comments, anything that people would like to discuss?
Hi.
Hello. Yeah, I suppose if I look back at some of the, I suppose the areas that came up most prominently within the chat itself, and maybe some of the folks in the first couple of sections of the presentation can come back in, I suppose, around mental health issues increasing for women during COVID-19. Domestic violence was talked about quite a bit in terms of in the context of our own countries. But I suppose as well, there was discussions around how do we engage women, how do we empower women in that sense in our own countries. How do, I suppose, cultural and different societal barriers impact or influence the perceived or actual barriers for women in education, employment, climate action, and so on. And also, I suppose, how do we ensure that we get, I suppose, that we ensure that women feel like they can contribute to all aspects of society and discussion in a safe and meaningful way. So I don't know if there's anything else that people wanted to comment on from those particular sections. There is a question here and from Haruna that if you were to sit in the president's chair in your respective countries for one day, what change would you make in the context of gender equality? So I don't know, does anyone want to go first from the group? What change would you make in the context of gender equality if you got to be president for the day?
Well, in Mexico, if I was president for a day, what I will do is to impulse STEM areas for women and mainly education, but also promote some support, some economic support, particularly to women, because in my country, there is many women who are starting a new business. It can go for sending food, to sending clothes, to sending anything. So many women doesn't know how to start or how to make it. So I think that my support will be focusing women who are mothers or who are self-employed, and it will be give them support as economical as an educational, so they can advance. Who knows, maybe in the future there will be funds of employment for another girls or women.
Perfect. Anyone else in the group? If you were president for the day, what change would you like to make? Yeah, Carla, go ahead.
Bueno, ayer algo que compartíamos en el grupo era sobre la emancipación, ¿no? Primero comentaban que empoderaríamos a las mujeres, pero creo que hay que llamarle también emancipación porque para eso se generan los grupos, los espacios, los colectivos en donde las mujeres se sientan escuchadas, ¿no? Se sientan con esta como con esta necesidad de poder compartir esas inquietudes que se están generando dentro de sus hogares, como dentro de las culturas, como también en los espacios sociales. Entonces creo que sin duda estamos hablando de una cuestión que se tiene que trabajar colectivamente y es algo que casi no se menciona a raíz, a profundidad. Entonces, algo que yo comentaba también ayer con algunos compañeros del grupo es que somos parte de este cambio, ¿no? Entonces, creo que para eso estamos aquí, ¿no? Para conocer esas diferentes realidades en las que nos encontramos. Por ejemplo, ayer comentaban que Cameron y Patrick, que incluso en las mujeres no hay mucho movimiento dentro de sus países, ¿no? Pero yo veo que aquí en México, en mi comunidad, hay mucho movimiento por parte de las mujeres porque queremos cambiar esa realidad que estamos como cansadas, en las que pues esa normalidad que genera violencia de género, ¿no? Entonces creo que para eso estamos aquí. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Carla, for that. Keela, do you want to go ahead?
Yes. Complementando lo que comentaba Carla y Karen, yo creo que, bueno, hace poco estaba en un programa de fortalecimiento a healthcare y justamente trataban de empoderar a mujeres, pero ¿cómo? ¿Cómo haces eso, no? Sí tiene que haber participación de nosotras, o eso, al menos eso es lo que creo, participación de todas nosotras para support them, y creo que es muy importante porque hay comunidades en las que literal son solo 10 mujeres las que están tomando acción, ¿no? Lo que podemos hacer es dar a conocer. Nosotros somos líderes de cambio en nuestras comunidades, independientemente de dónde estemos e independientemente de la acción que tomemos. Una pequeña acción puede generar un gran cambio. Así que tenemos que darnos a conocer, tenemos que seguir educando a las próximas generaciones y buscar cómo apoyarlos, no solamente con nuestros esfuerzos, sino también económicamente. Nosotros que estamos aquí, que formamos parte del programa de Gender Equity, creo que podemos hacer muchísimo con lo que ya tenemos. Nos tenemos los unos a los otros alrededor del mundo y creo que lo que estamos diciendo y lo que estamos haciendo ahora puede impactar la vida de muchas personas y de los que nos están oyendo. Ese es mi comentario. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Keela, for that contribution. Helen, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, as per now, if today, right now, if I was made the president of Kenya, I would make sure that all the girls that got pregnant during COVID-19 go back to school and they get a wholesome education. Now you have to understand that this is a special lot of people. It's a girl that has given birth before its time or when she's young, she needs more care than other girls. You know, even if you send her to school, sending her to school is not enough. She has many issues to grapple with. Her self-esteem might be affected. You know, she might be stigmatized because you understand how some of these societies are. You will get stigmatized if you give birth before getting married, you know. So I would put up measures that would make sure that these girls go to school, they get a wholesome education, they are mentored, and they feel they are not alone in this journey, and that nothing is okay, everything is not lost. Actually, they have to go an extra mile because they are a mother and a student at the same time, but actually everything is not lost. And having done this, I believe that even when I won't be there, because I won't be a president forever, they will get a chance to fight for themselves. They get a chance to be there for themselves, even when I'll be, God forbid, long gone, or maybe I won't just be serving in that seat. And apart from that, even themselves, having been helped by someone, they will go ahead and impact other people. You see, you help them, they help other people, and like that, and everyone comes on board. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for that. Yaris, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Buenas tardes. Les saludo desde Veracruz. Estoy escuchando a cada uno de ustedes y agradezco la invitación. Soy de la Universidad Veracruzana de la Facultad de Pedagogía. Soy docente y miembro de la facultad. Escuchaba a Carla, a Keila y estoy completamente de acuerdo con cada uno de sus comentarios y también escucho las realidades que nos muestran cada uno de ustedes a través de Halima, a través de Helen. Y bueno, el impacto cultural también tiene mucho que ver porque no nada más es, desde mi punto de vista, llegar desde las universidades. Yo apuesto también por la parte axiológica para que desde que son niños, desde que somos pequeños, tanto niños como niñas, aprendan acerca de esta cuestión de género y del respeto y de los valores. Y escucho la realidad de Helen cuando habla acerca de los estudiantes embarazadas. Y bueno, en México, Carla, Keila, Karen también saben que en muchas universidades, en muchas escuelas, los mismos maestros, pues apoyamos a los alumnos, a las alumnas, y trae a tu niño, y bueno, esto no es un obstáculo, ¿no? Qué bueno que Helen lo está compartiendo, porque sí debe de ser, o debería de ser, en todos los países, en todo el mundo. Porque el hecho de ser madre o padre en su momento no es un impedimento para que continúen sus estudios. Entonces, para mí, la verdad es muy enriquecedor escucharlos a cada uno de ustedes. Dejé por ahí mi correo electrónico por si alguno quiere compartir con mis estudiantes en mi facultad, en mi país, alguna de sus conferencias y experiencias, estaría muy agradecida, pero definitivamente apuesto porque también se incluyan estos temas, pero desde que somos pequeños, desde que está el niño o la niña muy pequeño y que sepa que tiene un derecho, que sepa que hay valores y que sepa que hay respeto y que sepa que podemos continuar dentro del cambio climático. Esta situación de la pandemia, han crecido con la pandemia, tienen un enfoque diferente de las cosas y se han observado diferentes realidades en las mujeres, ¿no? De violencia, se han evidenciado estas realidades. Y entonces esto invita a repensar y a romper paradigmas y decir, la mujer tiene que ser respetada, debe de hacer valer sus derechos y pues continuar desarrollándose. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much for that. Dr. Shahab?
Yes, Cameron. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank the whole team, Yaris, Kila, Carla, Karen, Lima, everyone. And then especially thanks you, Cameron and Patrick. Initially, when the session was started, so I was thinking that only the women's are talking for themselves. But at the end, when you came, so then I consider, okay, there are males also that they are talking for the women participation and their role in gender role in climate change and like these issues. So different issues actually discussed in the sessions and very interested. These were hot issues nowadays. But to me, it's actually you people didn't talk about the academia in the women environmentalists role and the women academia role who are working. Is I can see that the papers and the books which are publishing around the world, so there is also actually gender inequality. So actually there is low women participation in environmental sciences, and then we came the climate change and in these things. So this is also very hard issue that women are not taking part in that study areas. So particularly I'm talking about developing countries. So to me is that in the policy and at the end of the session when the policy option came, so there were that gender sensitive policies were discussed, that it is the need that in policy inclusion the women should be involved in climate change and these issues. But to me, is actually the main indicator is that how we can increase the women participation in climate change. Because they are doing very well. We have also came to know different case studies from Kenya, and two case studies we have also quoted. So actually they are playing very well, but the donors should divert their attention towards, and there should be the policy actions from the donor side, that how much the women role is needed to them. So if they actually include this women participation in their policy, so then the countries will be obliged and they will take the women's role. Otherwise, I think that to me is this is the one indicator that we can increase the women participation in climate change mitigation and adaptation, that if the donor demanded. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. It resonates with a point I was going to make on the question of if I was president for the day, what would I do? And currently in my university, I sit on a group called the Athena Swan application for the School of Medicine, which looks at the incorporation of women and I suppose a gender analysis on progression through undergraduate to postgraduate to academia in lectures and so on and so forth. And I suppose it is a massive issue, particularly in Ireland, but also more globally, where you can see a trend of often higher numbers of women in undergraduate courses, but that doesn't progress through up to senior lecturer, professor, so on and so forth. So I think there's ways that we could do. So I would personally love to see more women progressing in STEM subjects. That's the area I'm in, but I think there's still lots of barriers there. So I'd like to, roll out an Athena Swan based thing throughout the entire country, if I could, for everyone to get involved with that and to get more women involved in STEM, and I suppose getting opportunities like their male counterparts do. Folks, we've got about 5 minutes left. I know that Halima and Carla had their hands up, so I'll go to them and see how much time we have left at the end. So Halima, I'll go to you first, and then Carla, I'll come to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Cameron. I hope I am audible. I'd like to state that all these conversations we're having just circle around the theme of change, and the steps we make in achieving this change normally is through these talks, conferences, policy making, and participation of women. All these are changes that are made. And as president, if I was given a chance to be president, I'll make sure that all decisions, all policies, or laws are action oriented, because most of the time these end up just being papers that are put in desks and file lockers, and they're locked and forgotten about, and our leaders tend to not follow up on the changes that were made. So I will make sure that all the legal changes, the policies that affect women, not just women, that affect education sector, health sector, and the entire well-being of the country, to be action oriented, such that when decisions are made, they're followed up upon and the change is actually seen. So many decisions have been made and so many conferences are held, and people, yes, they talk, they engage, they make decisions, but there is no change that is seen, it's forgotten. So let us make changes and let us see those changes, and then we will have achieved gender parity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Halima. Carla, go ahead.
Bueno, con respecto a lo que comentaban anteriormente mis compañeras, compañeros, estoy muy contenta de estar aquí y sin duda hay muchas cuestiones en las que debemos que tomar en cuenta. Creo que para eso son estas conferencias, para conocer las diferentes realidades en que vivimos en diferentes países, ¿no? Porque sin duda estamos aquí. Y creo que con respecto a lo de ser presidenta, igual ahora sí que tengo que ser más como apoyando a los colectivos tanto de mujeres como de hombres, organizaciones no gubernamentales, en donde fomenten la emancipación de todas las personas, no solo de mujeres, hombres, y ahorita con lo del término inclusivo, de las personas que no se consideran de un género binario. Es un tema que en México está revolucionando mucho, ¿no? Y también algo que quería comentar era con respecto a que las mujeres sí estamos involucradas en estos temas del cambio climático y sin duda también en los términos políticos, porque algo que aprendí también es que la política está en todo lo que decidimos y sin duda es generar, es crear, es hacer el cambio, ¿no? Entonces creo que para eso, ahora sí que para eso, nosotros nos encontramos aquí generando ese cambio. Y sin duda este cambio lo llevamos a nuestras comunidades porque es algo que me gusta mucho también. Y una frase que comentaba Yasnara Aguilar, que es una activista de Oaxaca, era que pensemos global y actuemos local, ¿no? Entonces creo que conocer todos estos puntos que tenemos nosotros de diferentes lugares es algo que podemos llevar a nuestras comunidades, es algo que podemos incluir en nuestras políticas públicas. Entonces creo que es muy importante todo lo que estamos compartiendo. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Carla, and thanks for bringing up the point as well around non-binary individuals and the unique challenges that that group faces. As well, I suppose there's multiple layers to how gender inequity and inequality faces lots of different groups. And as someone that identifies as non-binary, I appreciate the support. So thank you so much for bringing that point up. Folks, we're at past now. I know that Elaf had her hand up, so I'm going to, if you allow me, if you indulge for a couple extra minutes to give the last word to Elaf, and then we'll close up the session.
I think I wanted to go back to a point that Mr. Shahab has mentioned, which is how donors can enforce some sort of regulations or standards that would push people basically, and specifically CSOs, in the direction of ensuring that climate action and pandemic resilience is gender sensitive, that is done and not even on just the academia level. I thought even staging when they formulate their foreign policies, and this is something that I think governments like Sweden and Canada has been working on. They've had explicit feminist foreign policies, and this is something that I see with my engagement with the Canadian embassy in Sudan, where they only fund or push for action that is gender sensitive, and you can't basically work with them in any area unless you do a proper gender-based analysis. So I think that's a step in the right direction. And yeah, that's my contribution. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elaf. And folks, I think we're just about out of time, but we really appreciate, I just put into the chat there, we really appreciate everyone's comments, engagement, your thoughts, your suggestions and solutions as well. I suppose we spent a long time over the last few months creating and curating a really interesting and interactive presentation on what is not a very easy topic to condense into an hour and a half. So we appreciate the time that you've given us and the interaction and discussion that you've given to us as well. And we'd be happy to chat to anyone in the future about any of the stuff that we've talked about today. And wish you the best for the rest of the conference. I know for me, it's about 6:30 in the evening, so I'm very excited to go have dinner. But I think it's still lunchtime and morning time for other people. So either enjoy your day or enjoy your evening. And thanks so much for joining.